My girlfriend told me, "You're the backup plan women choose after their real options fail." I quietly stood up and left forever. Months later, she watched my success story air on television while sitting alone in the same apartment she once mocked me for renting. "You're the backup plan women choose after their real options fail." She said it the way someone reads a grocery list. Flat, casual, like the words had been sitting in her mouth for months, and she'd finally gotten tired of holding them there. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat on the couch I'd bought with 3 weeks of overtime pay, in the apartment she called embarrassing, and I let every syllable land exactly where she'd aimed it. The living room felt smaller than it ever had. The ceiling felt lower. Even the light coming through the window, that gray, late-afternoon Manhattan light that I'd always loved, looked different in that moment. Dull, like something had been switched off. Alicia stood by the kitchen counter with her arms crossed and her jaw set, watching me the way someone watches a slow-moving car accident, not with horror, but with a strange, quiet satisfaction. She wasn't done. "I mean it," she said. "I've been thinking about this for a long time. You're safe. You're comfortable. But safe and comfortable isn't what I want anymore. It's not what I deserve." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I thought about all the mornings I'd made coffee before she woke up because she hated making it herself. I thought about the birthday she forgot and the birthday I planned entirely alone, just to make her smile. I thought about the night she cried at 2 in the morning and I drove 40 minutes across the city without asking a single question. I thought about all of that. And then I stood up. No speech. No raised voice. No tears. I just stood up, walked to the closet, pulled out my jacket, and put it on. "Where are you going?" she asked. I didn't answer. The door clicked shut behind me. And what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known in that moment, was that it was the last time she would ever have any power over me. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I want to be honest with you about who I was before that night, because this isn't a story about a perfect man who got treated badly by a villain. It's messier than that. It's more human than that. I was 29 years old, and I had been with Alicia for 2 years and 8 months. We lived in Astoria, Queens, not Manhattan, technically, but close enough that I could tell myself the commute was worth it. I worked as a mid-level data analyst at a logistics firm in Midtown. Not glamorous. Not the kind of job that makes people lean forward at dinner parties. But it paid my rent, it paid my bills, and I was good at it, genuinely good at it, in the quiet way that people are good at things when no one is watching. I had maybe $4,000 in savings. A lease I couldn't break without penalty. A social circle that had, over 3 years, slowly become Alicia's social circle more than mine. I had Wesley, my best friend from college, one of the few people in my life who had known me before her. And I had plans. Our plans, really. We'd talked about moving into a better apartment by the end of the year. We'd talked about Europe, a trip we'd been building in a shared notes document for 14 months, adding restaurants and museums and train routes like it was something real, something that was actually going to happen. She'd mentioned, once, in the early days, that she thought I'd make a good father. I hadn't forgotten that. I wasn't the kind of man who forgot things like that. Which brings me to my flaws. Because I had them. I was too patient. That sounds like a compliment, and people always delivered it that way. You're so patient. It's one of your best qualities, but patience, when it goes unexamined, becomes something else. It becomes avoidance. It becomes a story you tell yourself so you don't have to have the difficult conversation. I avoided confrontation the way some people avoid bad weather. I rerouted. I reframed. I waited for things to improve on their own instead of naming what was wrong. And I trusted people, really trusted them, in a way that, looking back, was less a virtue and more a blind spot. I trusted Alicia completely. Even after the Tuesday in February when I found a name I didn't recognize saved in her phone under a contact called Simply G. I saw it by accident. Her phone lit up on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower, and I glanced over out of reflex, and there it was. 1 letter. She came out and picked up her phone, and I didn't say anything. I filed it away in that place where people file things they're not ready to look at directly. I told myself it was nothing. I was very good at telling myself things were nothing. Here is the thing about Alicia that no one seems to want to acknowledge when they hear how this story ends. She was extraordinary, not in the soft, understated way I would eventually learn to value. In the loud, immediate, unmistakable way that makes a room rearrange itself around one person. She laughed from her chest. She had opinions about everything. Architecture, film, the right way to cook a soft-boiled egg, the precise moment a party becomes worth attending. And she delivered them with this absolute conviction that made you want to agree with her even when you didn't. The first night I met her, at a mutual friend's rooftop party in Brooklyn, she was arguing with a guy twice her size about whether Scorsese's later films were better than his early ones. She was wrong, but she was so committed to being wrong that I found myself almost agreeing. I introduced myself an hour later, and she said, "I know who you are. Bethany mentioned you. She said you were quiet." She made it sound like a flaw. I said, "Is it?" She tilted her head and looked at me for a long moment. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said. 3 months later, we were dating. 2 months after that, she moved into my apartment. Her lease was ending. It made sense. We'd spent every night together for weeks anyway. And there was a period, there was a real period, where everything was exactly what it appeared to be. She had a habit of stealing my oversized gray sweater and wearing it around the apartment on Sunday mornings, padding around the kitchen, making terrible eggs while I sat on the couch and watched her and thought, quietly, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We had a bit, an ongoing joke that started on our second date and never really stopped, about a terrible movie we'd watched on a dare. Anytime one of us did something embarrassing, the other would say, in the flat voice of the film's lead actor, "That was a regrettable decision." It sounds stupid now, but in the moment, every single time, it cracked us both open. She was the one who convinced me to start cooking properly. Not by criticizing my cooking, that came later, but by standing beside me one Saturday and saying, with genuine enthusiasm, "Okay, we're making risotto. I've watched 3 videos. We can do this." We absolutely could not do it. The risotto was awful, but we ate it standing at the kitchen counter, and she said, 10 out of 10, would humiliate ourselves again, and I kissed her on the side of her head and thought, this is it. This is the thing people mean when they say they've found their person. She pushed me, too, in the early days. Not critically, encouragingly. "You're smarter than that job," she said once, maybe 4 months in. "You should be building something." I didn't know what that meant yet, but I kept it. I kept all of it. The good memories have a way of becoming evidence against you later. Because when things started to change, I kept going back to those mornings with the gray sweater and the terrible risotto and the rooftop argument about Scorsese, and I told myself, that's who she really is. The rest is temporary. The rest will pass. That was the first curiosity loop I couldn't close. The second was simpler but stranger. About 8 months in, we had dinner with Stacy, Alicia's closest friend, sharp-tongued and perceptive, the kind of woman who watched people the way hawks watch open fields. Stacy looked at me across the table at some point during the meal and said, completely without context, "You're the most patient person I've ever met. That's either a gift or a problem, depending on who you're with." Alicia laughed. I smiled. But Stacy held my gaze for a beat too long, and I had the strange feeling she wasn't talking to Alicia at all. The third loop opened on a Saturday afternoon about 14 months in, when I found, tucked into the pocket of an old jacket she'd borrowed, a torn piece of paper with a handwritten address on the Upper East Side and 2 words underneath it. Worth it. I didn't recognize the handwriting. I put it in the kitchen drawer where I kept batteries and takeout menus and things I didn't know what to do with. I didn't ask her about it. See what I mean about avoidance? He appeared in her conversation around the 22nd month. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way most important things arrive, gradually, quietly, unremarkably at first. She mentioned him in passing one evening. Stacy introduced me to this entrepreneur guy at that gallery thing last Thursday. He does something in sustainable real estate. He's interesting. That was it. I nodded. I asked what we were doing for dinner. But Garrett kept appearing. Small mentions at first. Garrett was talking about this restaurant in the West Village. Apparently the wait list is 8 months. Garrett thinks the market is about to shift. He says people who aren't paying attention right now are going to get left behind. Garrett's doing this thing where he takes cold plunges every morning. He says it completely rewires how you think about discomfort. I want to be fair to myself here and say I wasn't immediately jealous. I wasn't the kind of man who bristled at every male name. But there was something about the way she said Garrett that nagged at me. The way her posture changed slightly when she mentioned him, a barely perceptible straightening, like she was organizing herself for a different kind of conversation. Wesley noticed before I did. We had beers one Thursday night, the 2 of us in his apartment in Bed-Stuy, and somewhere in the middle of our second round he said, "You doing okay?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You seem distracted." I told him about Garrett. Not the whole picture, just the pattern of mentions. Wesley listened the way he always listened, completely still, eyes forward, like he was reading something I hadn't yet shown him. He said, "How often?" I thought about it. "A few times a week, maybe." Wesley made a face that I categorized, at the time, as casual skepticism. He said, Just HM. I said, "Don't me." He said, "I'm not doing anything." But I saw him file it away. And then, 3 weeks later, the first real pattern interrupt arrived. I came home early from work, a rare thing, on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The apartment was empty, which was fine. Alicia worked at a design agency in Tribeca and her hours were unpredictable. Except her laptop was open on the kitchen table, and I walked past it to get a glass of water, and I saw, in the 2 seconds before the screen dimmed, a message thread. I didn't read it. I want to be clear about that. I saw Garrett's name at the top of the thread in 3 or 4 lines of text, and I deliberately looked away. Because I was not the kind of person who read other people's messages. Because I believed, I deeply, genuinely believed, in the kind of trust that doesn't need to snoop. What I did see, in those 2 seconds, was not text. It was a photo, or the corner of one. A restaurant, by the look of it. 2 glasses of wine. I poured my water. I went to the living room. I sat down, and I thought, that's probably nothing. They were probably at a work event. People take photos of wine glasses at restaurants. It means nothing. I was extraordinarily skilled at talking myself out of what I already knew. The first criticism arrived without fanfare. We were getting ready for bed in November, about 2 months before the end, and she looked around the bedroom, our bedroom, technically, though it had always felt more mine, and she said, "Do you ever think about moving?" I said, "Sure, when we can afford something better." She said, "That's the thing, though. I don't know when that is. We're saving. You're saving $400 a month. That's not saving. That's postponing." I turned off the light. She didn't apologize. And over the next several weeks, the criticism arrived with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety. The apartment was brought up again, square footage, neighborhood, the building's old pipes. My car was mentioned. I had one, a practical 7-year-old sedan that ran perfectly well. My salary was referenced in the context of people we knew. Jordan just got his 3rd promotion. Stacy's boyfriend put a down payment on a place in Hoboken. And my career, my quiet, consistent, genuinely upward trajectory career, was the recurring theme. You've been in the same role for almost 2 years. What's the ceiling on what you do? Do you ever think about whether you're being ambitious enough? Each time, I absorbed it. Each time, I found a measured, non-confrontational response. Each time, she seemed faintly dissatisfied with the conversation, like she'd been hoping for a different kind of engagement. It was Dean who noticed first, actually. He was a senior director at my firm, 15 years older than me, the kind of professional who'd failed publicly twice and succeeded quietly 3 times, and who wore the whole history of it with a strange lightness. He'd been mentoring me, loosely, for about a year. Started with a 15-minute conversation about a report I'd written that he thought showed real analytical instinct. By this point, we were having lunch twice a month. One afternoon in late November, over sandwiches in the park, he said, "You seem like you're carrying something." I shrugged. He said, "You don't have to tell me what it is. I'm just noting it. Sometimes when people are being made to feel small by one part of their life, it shrinks them everywhere." I thought about that for a long time. I didn't tell him about Alicia, but I started staying later at work. Not because anyone asked me to, because work was the one place where what I produced meant something, where my judgment was respected, where the quiet thoroughness I'd always had actually counted for something. Dean noticed that too. He started sending me things, articles, frameworks. One afternoon, an email with the subject line, "You should know about this," and a description of an independent data consulting firm he'd run briefly years before, the structure of it, the margins, the model. I read everything. I filed it all away. I had no plan yet, but something was beginning. And then came the second pattern interrupt. I should have seen it coming. In retrospect, every signal was there. Alicia left her email open one evening. Not her laptop this time. Her phone, left face up on the bathroom counter while she took a shower, and I passed by it and saw, without meaning to, a forwarded confirmation. A hotel confirmation. For one room. In Philadelphia. For a weekend I'd been told she was visiting her college roommate upstate. I stood in the bathroom doorway for a long time. The shower was running. I set the phone back down the way I'd found it. I went to the kitchen. I made tea I didn't drink. And I waited. Not for an explanation. Not for a confession. I just waited. Because that's what I did. That's all I knew how to do. I waited, and the waiting became a wall, and behind the wall, I was being slowly dismantled. The famous line. The line I've turned over 1,000 times since. It didn't arrive during a fight. That's the thing no one expects. There was no escalating argument. No slammed doors leading up to it. It was a Sunday afternoon in January, overcast, the kind of day where the whole city feels like it's waiting for permission to move. We were in the apartment she'd been slowly teaching me to resent. I was on the couch reading. She was at the kitchen table with her laptop. And for some reason I still can't fully explain, I asked, "Are you happy?" Not accusatory. Not loaded. Just a genuine question. One I'd been holding back for longer than I could account for. She closed the laptop slowly. She looked at me, and she said, "I don't think happiness is the right word for what I feel here." "What is the right word?" I said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I think I've been settling." Something shifted. Not dramatically. Just a quiet, interior shifting, like the moment before an engine dies. "What does that mean?" "It means," she paused, seemed to make a decision. "It means I think you're a safe choice. A comfortable choice. Not because you're exceptional, but because you were available. Alicia, I'm being honest with you. Don't you want honesty? Not like this." "There it is," she said, and something sharpened in her voice. "That's exactly it. You never want the real conversation. You always want the comfortable version of everything." I set my book down. "You're the backup plan women choose," she said, "after their real options fail." The room didn't make a sound. I remember thinking, with strange clarity, she practiced that. Not necessarily out loud, but somewhere in her mind, she had rehearsed that sentence. She had selected those words the way someone selects an instrument. To cut cleanly. I stood up. She watched me. "Where are you going?" she said. I pulled on my jacket. "We're not done talking." We were done talking. I put my keys in my pocket. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say a word. I closed the door behind me the way you close a book you've finished, not with violence, but with finality. On the stairs, I passed our neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Falk who always smelled like pipe tobacco and never asked questions. He nodded at me. I nodded back. And I walked out into the gray January air, and I kept walking, and I didn't stop until I was standing on the bridge overlooking the river, watching the water move underneath me, slow and indifferent and completely unconcerned with my particular devastation. She thought she'd won. She thought silence was surrender. She was still operating on the old model, the one where my patience was the same as passivity, where my restraint was the same as weakness. She didn't yet understand what she'd done. She had just handed me the one thing I'd been missing, a reason to stop waiting. The first month was honest. I won't dress it up. I slept badly. I ate inconsistently. I called Wesley too late at night and talked about things that didn't make sense, and he listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always loved about him. I moved into a smaller place in Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant, 3 blocks from Wesley, and I sat with the smallness of it and made a deliberate choice not to hate it. It was mine. Completely, unambiguously mine. No shared territory. No one else's taste on the walls. The second thing I did was find a therapist. Her name was not important, but what she said in our third session was, "What are you afraid would happen if someone saw you clearly and still left?" I sat with that question for 3 weeks before I could answer it. The answer, when it came, was harder than I expected. And in the answering of it, something quietly, incrementally shifted. I started running. Not because it was dramatic or cinematic. Because I needed somewhere to put the noise in my head, and running was the one place where the noise had to compete with breathing. I ran badly at first. 3 blocks and I was done. By March, I was running 5 miles in the mornings before work. At the office, something changed too. Dean had noticed I was different. Not worse, different. More focused in a way that had an edge to it. "What happened?" he said one afternoon. I told him a version of the truth. He nodded slowly and said, "Good. Just that. Good." I said, "That's your response?" He said, "Pain with direction is just fuel. Sounds like you finally have some." And he handed me a folder. Inside it was a proposal outline. A framework for a small, independent data consulting firm. The kind that serviced mid-sized logistics companies that couldn't afford full internal analytics departments. He said, "I've been waiting to show you this for 6 months. I wanted to see if you were ready." I said, "Are you offering to partner with me?" He said, "I'm offering to advise you. There's a difference. You need to build this yourself." I took the folder home. I read it 4 times. I made notes. The third pattern interrupt arrived on a Tuesday in April. An email appeared in my work inbox from a woman named Holly Mercer. producer at a digital media company I'd actually heard of. They did documentary-style features on unusual business stories, emerging entrepreneurs, pivot narratives. She'd somehow found an industry blog post I'd written 6 months earlier, a technical piece about supply chain analytics that I'd published almost as an afterthought, and she wanted to talk. Not about the firm I was building, not about anything I'd done yet, about the way I thought about problems. "We're developing a series on unconventional paths in business," she wrote. "Your piece had something most don't. I'd love to meet." I almost deleted it. I thought it was spam. I actually had it in the trash before something made me fish it back out. I replied the next day. Wesley said, when I told him, "Don't overthink it. Just go." I went. I wasn't watching. I want to be clear about that. I was not monitoring Alicia's life. I was not checking her social media. I was building something, and the building of it took everything I had and left very little room for backward looking. But Bethany, our mutual friend from the old circle, stayed in both our orbits, because Bethany was the kind of person who moved through social friction the way water moves through rock, slowly and without drama. She texted me in March. "Just hope you're good. You seem like you're doing well." I responded warmly. We got coffee in late March, and Bethany, who was constitutionally incapable of cruelty, told me what she knew in the most careful way she could manage. Alicia and Garrett had been something. Bethany didn't use the word affair. She said, involved, and she said it quietly, and she let the words sit between us without elaboration. I nodded. I thanked her for telling me. I didn't collapse, which surprised me. Maybe because I'd already done the collapsing, quietly and privately, back in November when I'd seen that hotel confirmation on her phone. Some part of me had already buried the body. What Bethany told me next was more interesting. Garrett, it turned out, was not what he appeared. The sustainable real estate firm was real, but troubled. There had been investor problems. A project in the Bronx that had stalled. Money that had moved in unclear directions. He was still charming, still present in the right rooms, but the rooms were getting smaller. "She's still with him," Bethany said carefully. "I think. But she seems." She paused. "Different," she settled on. "Different how?" "Quieter. Stacy said she doesn't go out much anymore. She still has the same apartment." That last detail landed with a weight I hadn't expected. Same apartment. The apartment she told me felt like standing still. Social media told a version of the same story for anyone inclined to read it. The posts had thinned. Where once there had been a steady stream, restaurants, events, captions that vibrated with curated confidence. Now there were long silences. The occasional photo. Careful lighting. Captions that tried slightly too hard. I recognized it immediately. The performance of fine. I had performed that for almost 8 months in the back half of our relationship. I knew exactly what it cost. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that too. I felt something more like ache. Because I had loved her. That was real, even if everything else had been complicated. And the version of her I'd loved, the one who laughed from her chest and stole my gray sweater and argued about Scorsese at rooftop parties, that version was clearly not doing well. Regret, when it settles, doesn't look like the movies. It doesn't look like crying. It looks like a person in the same apartment with a quieter feed and slightly dimmer captions. And Garrett, who was supposed to be the elevation, the upgrade, the correction to everything she'd found lacking in me, was not holding up his end of whatever bargain she'd made. By October, 10 months after I'd walked out of that apartment, the consulting firm was real. Not dramatically real. Not wealthy overnight real. But real in the way that matters. Legally filed. First 2 clients signed. A corner of Dean's old office I was borrowing until I could afford my own. Holly and I had been meeting regularly since April. She was sharp and efficient and believed in the kind of storytelling that found the architecture inside real people's lives. The series she was developing was for a streaming platform that had recently expanded into documentary content. 6 episodes. Unconventional business paths. She wanted me for episode 3, not as the finished product. She wanted to document the building of it. The consulting firm, the transition from employee to builder, the analytical framework I developed. She said, in our 5th meeting, "What makes your story interesting isn't the success. It's the specific kind of quiet it came from." I asked her what she meant. She said, "You didn't rage quit. You didn't make a scene. You just became." Filming began in September and ran through the fall. It was stranger than I expected, having a camera in the spaces where I worked. But Holly's team was unobtrusive, and the work was real, and the footage, apparently, reflected that. And then, in November, Holly told me something she'd been sitting on for a while, something she'd found during research, something that reframed the entire preceding year. She said, "I want to show you something, and I want you to tell me if you want us to include it." She handed me a printed article from a business journal. It was about Garrett, his firm, the Bronx Project, the investigation that had been quietly opened by the state attorney general's office. He hadn't been charged. Not yet. But the article detailed, in clean and careful language, the architecture of a misrepresentation. Investors told one story. Reality built another. And there, near the bottom of the third paragraph, was a detail that made something in me go very still. A list of people who had been, according to sources, early advocates for the firm. People who had helped create its social credibility. One of them was described as a design professional introduced to the principles through the New York social scene. I thought about Alicia telling me Garrett was interesting. I thought about 8 months of subtle comparisons. I thought about the hotel confirmation in Philadelphia. And I understood, for the first time, the full geometry of what had happened. She hadn't just chosen someone she thought was better. She had chosen someone who had, whether consciously or not, used her admiration as a form of social currency. The elevation she'd been seeking, the world she was sure I couldn't give her, it had been constructed. Beautifully, convincingly, expensively constructed. But constructed. Holly looked at me carefully. She said, "We don't have to include this. The story works without it." I said, "Leave it out." She nodded once. "Good answer," she said. The episode aired on a Thursday evening in January, 14 months after I'd walked out of that apartment. I watched it at Wesley's place. His idea, the right call. He'd bought wine he couldn't really afford and made the kind of dinner that showed up unannounced in the best version of friendship. The episode was 42 minutes. It opened with Dean talking about what he'd seen in my analytical work 2 years earlier. It moved through the transition, the small office, the first clients, the running. Holly had included footage of that, early morning light on the bridge, which felt too cinematic, but also, apparently, tested very well with audiences. At 22 minutes in, there was a line I hadn't scripted. Holly had asked me, during one of the interviews, why I thought so many people who had the capacity for a different kind of life never built it. I'd said, usually because someone important to them decided what they were worth before they had a chance to figure it out themselves. And they believed it. She'd kept it in. I watched myself say it on Wesley's television and felt a strange double exposure. The person I'd been when I said it, and the person who was watching it now, and the distance between those two versions. Wesley handed me a glass of wine. He said, "You know she's going to see this." I said, "I know." He said, "You okay with that?" I thought about it. "It's not for her," I said finally. It never was. And across the city, not that I was watching, but Bethany would tell me later, unprompted, because Bethany was constitutionally honest, across the city, in Astoria, in the same apartment with the same old pipes and the same square footage that had never been enough, Alicia was watching. Bethany said she'd texted her around the 20-minute mark, had asked if she was watching it. Alicia had texted back 2 words. She said, "I'm watching." And then, 3 minutes later, "I know him." Bethany said she hadn't responded. Because what do you say to that? What is there to say when the person you called a backup plan turns out to have been, all along, the main story? Every insult returned in its own way. Not loudly, not in the way I'd imagined, in the dark months, might happen. Just returned. The apartment she'd mocked was on his screen as the starting point. The quiet she'd called comfortable was the thing Holly had called compelling. The patience she'd labeled passivity was the thing Dean called the discipline most people quit before developing. The backup plan was the primary narrative, and she was watching it in the same place she'd stood when she decided he wasn't enough. 3 days after the episode aired, she wrote to me. Not a call. A message. Long. Careful. I could tell she'd written it more than once. She said she'd watched the episode. She said it had been difficult to watch, and she wanted me to know she was glad I was doing well. She said she'd been thinking about the things she'd said. She said she regretted the way she'd handled things. She said she'd been in a hard place. She didn't elaborate on what the hard place consisted of, which told me she was not yet ready to tell the full truth, even in apology. She said she'd never forgotten the way I'd made her feel in the good years. She asked if I'd be open to talking. I read the message twice. I set my phone down. I made coffee. I stood at the window of the apartment I'd been slowly making into something I was proud of, and I looked at the street below, and I thought about the Sunday afternoon she'd called me a backup plan, and I thought about the hotel confirmation in Philadelphia, And I thought about every quiet Tuesday evening I'd spent making coffee for someone who was deciding, somewhere behind her closed expression, that I didn't reach the bar she'd built from another man's borrowed credentials. And then I thought about who I was now. Not in the triumphant, vindicated way. In the simpler way. I was a person who had built something. Not something enormous. Not something that would reshape the world. But mine. Genuinely, fully mine. And the message sitting on my phone was not from someone who had wronged me and was now corrected. It was from someone who was in pain and reaching for something familiar, because familiar is what we reach for when the new thing hasn't worked out. I understood that. I had compassion for it. But compassion and availability are not the same thing. I wrote back. 3 sentences. I wished her well. I meant it. I told her I hoped she found what she was looking for. I meant that too. And I said that I didn't think talking would help either of us. I sent it before I could reconsider. I put my phone face down on the counter. I finished my coffee. Wesley called that afternoon. Bethany had told him, inevitably, and he said, "What did you say?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." Just that. Good. Same word Dean had used 10 months earlier when I'd told him something had ended. I think that's the right word for things that conclude exactly as they should. Not great. Not triumphant. Not devastating. Just good. Settled. Correctly closed. The apartment never changed. Same building. Same pipes. Same gray afternoon light that came through the window. The person living inside it did. And for the first time in the story of that address, and the story of what I'd been while I lived there, it wasn't me. I was somewhere else now. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere I'd built with the specific material of every night I'd chosen not to beg. Every morning I'd chosen to run instead of collapse. Every afternoon I'd chosen the work over the wound. She called me a backup plan. What she didn't know was that backup plans, when they stop waiting to be called, become the only plan. And the only plan, it turns out, was always enough.